Pleasure to introduce today's seminar speaker, Dr. Brendan O'Connor, who's an associate professor in mechanical and aerospace engineering here at NC State. Dr. Brendan O'Connor has been in the department for 10 years. Prior to that, he got his PhD from University of Michigan. He works on a variety of topics, so he is trying to bring everything together towards one application here, which is organic photovoltaics. But he has been active in many, many different areas and teaches in very different diverse topics in their department too. So Brendan, take it away. It's all yours.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Akkad. So yeah, thanks for attending my talk this morning. I appreciate it. And I really look forward to sharing my results and learning about sort of the other faculty and the research that other faculty in the department are doing as we're having this sort of seminar series be really focused on faculty at NC State in our department this semester. So anyways, as Srinath mentioned, my topics are kind of varying. And so I'm going to try to talk, try to present a few of the topics that we're looking at in the lab. And yeah, the connecting theme will be organic photovoltaics. And it's, it's a lot to get through, but I hope you can follow along as much as possible, and hopefully if you have any questions, just jump in. So what I'm going to talk about today is how we can use these organic photovoltaics for solar powered greenhouses, sort of advanced photodetectors inspired by these mantis shrimp shown here, and then look at, so those are kind of two applications, and then the last topic we'll be looking at sort of more fundamental properties of these materials and how the viscoelasticity relates to device stability. All right, so before I begin, I just want to give a quick introduction to organic photovoltaics and how they work. And so on the left, you see organic photovoltaic cell. And typically what it is you fabricate it on a transparent substrate like glass. You have a transparent electrode where light would come in, and then you have a mixture of these organic semiconductors, and that's sort of the key to this organic component of the device. And it's a pretty thin layer, it's about 150 nanometers thick, and then it's followed by a reflective back electrode. And the idea here is that with these organic molecules, is if you look at the molecules here, it's usually a blend of a polymer and a small molecule. So the molecule here, the polymer sort of repeats. This is just one monomer unit of the polymer. And you'd have these carbon bonds along the length of it that alternate between a single carbon bond and a double carbon bond. And that results in this, what's called conjugation, that results in a delocalized electron orbital that allows electrical conductivity and some interesting semiconductor properties. And that's sort of the crux of what we mean by organic electronics. And you guys are probably familiar with OLED displays, a lot of OLED smartphones, et cetera, and those are using organic LEDs, which is a similar concept. So that the process would be that you would have light come in, it would get absorbed, and over here is sort of the energy diagram of how this would work. You have these electron energy levels, and you have a bottom filled electron energy level, sort of topmost filled electron energy level. Light would come in, it would excite an electron to an excited state across what's called a band gap. So there's no allowed electron energy states in this gap here. You have this excited electron, it would leave behind a hole, and then you have this electron hole pair called an exciton. This diffuses around, it's sort of coulombically attracted to each other. So you need something to pull it apart. And you need an interface between these two organic materials to pull apart that exciton, generate this free charge, and then collect that charge, get it to do some work, for example, in a solar cell, and then close that circuit and repeat the process. And so that would be the basic operating principles. And one of the keys here is that you usually mix these two materials together really tightly. You really want to form this sort of interdigitated structure, because this exciton, this sort of bound electron hole pair, only diffuses about 10 to 20 nanometers. And so it needs to see an interface within 10 to 20 nanometers. And so you need to have this sort of mixture of these two materials to get this process to work. And the morphology is a little bit more complicated than that, and I'll get back to that later in the talk. That's the basic idea. And if we look at, well, before I just, yeah, if you look at this for the purposes of, let's say, a solar cell, light would come in, it would, you know, you'd have that energy generation process and charge collection, and you get a current voltage curve that looks like this. And the maximum power out would be the product of the current and voltage, that would give you the maximum power. You divide that by the power of the incident light, and that would give you your efficiency of the solar cell. And what's kind of exciting about these organic solar cells is that their efficiencies have been improving for the past decade quite dramatically. Here's a plot of the efficiency over the past, 2 decades now. And what you see is, this is actually, the latest efficiency is actually over 18%, which, I sort of exploded from this graph in the past few years. There's a huge efficiency jump. And if you compare this to, let's say, silicon solar cells, silicon, the record in the lab is around 25%. And so this is actually, in the solar cells you buy, the silicon that you would buy, the module is typically less than 20%. So this is starting to, really approach sort of commercially relevant efficiencies. And this has been enabled by advances in molecular design. So there's a whole range of molecules, thousands of varieties of molecules people use to make these organic solar cells and organic photovoltaics. And this one on the right, sort of the one on the left is P3HT and PCBM. They're the sort of classic materials that were really popular until 2007 or so, and got us to around 6% efficiency. But that jump is through these more complex molecules that have been synthesized. And I'm not going to go into those details too much. I just want you to kind of be aware of the huge variety of molecules that are out there, because I will be touching on that a little bit. One of the things that this synthetic freedom gives you is the ability to tune the material properties of the solar cell. So for example, you have this small molecule here, different slight varieties of small molecules, a little bit different than this, but slight variations can vary, let's say, the absorption characteristics of the molecule. So this would be the absorption of a variety of molecules. And you can see that it ranges from kind of red to really near infrared. And that is one of the reasons for this efficiency jump, is that you can tune the absorption to collect more of the solar spectrum. But we also want to exploit that absorption character. And that's the sort of the key to the first part of this talk, is how do we use this for greenhouses? How do we use these organic solar cells for greenhouses? So before I talk about the specifics of the application, I sort of want to motivate this by talking about agriculture in general. So agriculture has this huge environmental footprint. It represents globally 24% of greenhouse gas emissions, 6% of land use, 70% of clean water use. And you couple that to growing global populations, growing global standard of living, and topsoil degradation, which is another issue. And there's really this idea that we're having really a stressed agriculture system that is not really sustainable. And so one potential solution to that is greenhouses. So greenhouses, if you just look at an example of growing lettuce in Arizona, and you look at how productive they are, and you look at the kilograms of food or crop produced per meter squared of land, there's an order of magnitude more productivity in terms of land area. There's basically an order of magnitude drop in water consumption. So there's, you need much less land, you consume much less water, so this becomes less of a stress. There's less topsoil degradation, less runoff of fertilizer and pesticides. The problem is that they consume significantly more energy. So if you look at a greenhouse, it's a couple orders of magnitude more energy than conventional farming. And so if you were to grow this on a large scale, greenhouses, the energy, our current energy portfolio would just blow up. And so, the idea here is, can we make these more energy neutral? And that's where this idea of having organic solar power integrated greenhouses comes from. And so the objective here is to develop self-sufficient greenhouses through integration of semi-transparent wavelength selective organic solar cells while optimizing plant growth. And so the idea is, can we have light come into the greenhouse, have solar cells, organic solar cells on the top that are semi-transparent, collect some light for power generation, let other light through, let's say the blue, some infrared, that the plant wants to grow. And so if we look at this from a spectral perspective, here's the sort of solar spectrum, the radiation. Chlorophyll, which the plants primarily use for photosynthesis, has very specific absorption around 450 nanometers and 650, so in the blue and the red, and hence the plants look kind of green. So can we let light through for that the chlorophyll can see, but then you have organic solar cell materials that absorb in these pockets that the plant might not necessarily need. And so this is actually a part of a NSF Infuse grant that spans a whole range of topics, from the chemistry of the materials to the device fabrication. So here's a picture of a semi-transparent solar cell, to look at plant growth, look at the energy balance of the system, and all the way to economics. So I'm just going to sort of touch on a couple of these topics in a couple minutes here. And the first one is, the primary goal here is to look at the energy and reduce the energy demand of the greenhouse. And so Ishwar, shown here, has done some really nice work looking at the energy balance of these greenhouses if we put some organic solar cells on the roof. And so he really did this detailed thermal envelope modeling that looks at the cooling and heating requirements over the course of the year, and really developed a custom model that can track the light very carefully and spectrally. So we can look at the solar radiation, goes through an organic solar cell stack that's really a bunch of thin films, so it uses some transfer matrix optical model that can look at the interference behavior and ultimately the transmitted light. And then we have the light coming in and looks at sort of the solar gains, et cetera, and sort of does a detailed energy balance like that with that, and then also captures how much light's being absorbed by the solar cells to predict power generation. And so this energy balance is going to depend on geographic location. So he looked at 3 distinct climates in the US, Phoenix, Arizona, Raleigh, North Carolina, and Antigua, Wisconsin, and looked at this energy balance of these systems. And so if we have the energy load of a conventional greenhouse that operates year round and sort of goes up, as you would imagine, as the climate gets colder, we put on the organic, semi-transparent organic solar cells, and this is a specific type of cell, but I won't go into those details now. And we see the power generation and we see the new energy load. And it's actually kind of interesting. There's a drop in the energy load when we add these organic solar cells. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, sort of in the hot climate, there's sort of a natural shading aspect that can reduce the solar gains. But also the solar cells use indium tin oxide as a transparent electrode. And so it's a low emissivity coating, and which aren't typically applied in greenhouse glazing. And so we get this advantage of having low emissivity, which helps keep the heat in the winter. And so we get a lot of winter energy savings by just adding these solar cells before we even get to the power generation, which I think is quite interesting. But then we look at the power generation and we see we have a net surplus in Arizona. We can be net neutral, net zero in North Carolina. And we, in Wisconsin, we can't get there in terms of being net zero energy, but we can, make up almost 50% of the energy demand for the heating, which is still pretty substantial. And in Wisconsin, you'd say, well, maybe you just don't put greenhouses there, but it's actually kind of interesting that in Canada, there's actually, along the border, there's actually a fairly large greenhouse market or industry. So that's the energy side, and that looks promising. What about the plant growth? And so that's where we looked next. We looked at how are these plants going to grow under these organic solar cells. So we made these organic solar cell filters. They're these large panels. They're not functional, but they use the active organic solar cell materials, and they mimic the transmittance, which is the key here, because we take these panels, we put them on these boxes, we take some plants and put them underneath the boxes. We cover the side of the boxes in reflective mylar, so only light gets through the top. And you can see we use these different materials that have different colors and different transmission characteristics. And then we grew red leaf lettuce in these boxes. We put them in what's called the NC State Phytotron, which is a building on North Campus that is kind of interesting. They have these chambers like this one shown here where we did the study that have really controlled environments in terms of lighting, temperature, water supply, nutrients, etc. And so we take these boxes, we grow the lettuce underneath the filters, and then here are the sort of the results, if my slide will change. There we go. And what we found is, my computer's freezing on me a little bit, but that's okay. What we find is that here's the control red leaf lettuce after 30 days. Here's under this different filters, and you can see they grow fairly well. If we look at the fresh weight, there's some variance here depending on the filter type. But for this FI filter, this active layer material, the purple one and the bluish one, the PI, we see that statistically speaking, there's no real variation in the productivity of the crop, which is very promising that we can actually generate power without hurting the plant yield. And so that's sort of where this work is currently at. This lettuce is a sort of shade tolerant plant. And so if something was gonna do well, lettuce is gonna do well. So we need to move on and look at other crops. So we're starting to transition into look at tomato, which is a little bit more demanding. So that's sort of the one application of how we can use these organic solar cells for unique applications. The next topic I would like to talk about is photodetectors. So these photovoltaic cells can be used for solar energy harvesting, but they're also just sort of a light sensor in a way. And so we can use the same device structure as just a photodetector. And what we try to do with these photodetectors is actually have hyperspectral and polarization sensitive photodetection. And it's really inspired by these mantis shrimp. And here's the eye of the mantis shrimp, which is sort of one of the most advanced eyes in nature. So if we just think about what we typically have if we want to image a scene, right? We typically have a CCD camera where, and this is sort of broken apart view of the CCD camera where we have, let's say white light, you have a bunch of colors come in, it goes through some lens slit array focusing the light, then we go through a color filter, red, green, blue color filter, and then to the insensitive, color insensitive photodetecting elements. And then you would reproduce the red, green, blue. Our eyes are responsive to red, green, blue, and we can reconstruct the image. So this is just for 3 colors, but we might want to do more than 3 colors. And if we were to do more than 3 colors, then we'd have to have more filters placed laterally, and you'd reduce the resolution of the detector. And so we want to go from, let's say, just red, green, blue. Here's a picture of what looks like a mouse. This would be a typical camera. You'd have essentially 3 images of the mouse, one all red, green, and then blue, and then you again reconstruct that. But we want to go to something that has many more color detection characteristics, so you get a finer resolution of that spectrum at that particularly point on that image. And so this has a range of applications, ranging from biomedical imaging to astronomy to environmental monitoring, where you want this added information. And really this added information is usually related to trying to probe some sort of chemical feature. So for example, in biomedical imaging, I think this is a image of a tumor, and you can get the sort of the oxygen levels of the blood around this tumor and look how it's changing over time with treatment. And so now you can get a much more detailed view of the evolution of that tumor. In astronomy, there's applications in looking at the type of gases in an atmosphere for, let's say, a planet or a star, and then similarly for environmental monitoring, you can look at gases that are being emitted from a source. And so this is enabled by having greater spectral characteristics. But again, to do that, you know, you'd have to have more color filters laterally for an imaging detector, which then reduces the resolution. But we want to do even more than that. We want to go for more colors, but also get the polarization state of the light. So if we think about light in general, you know, we're familiar with intensity and wavelength of a typical camera, but what also defines
I think we lost Brandon, is it?
Yeah, I don't hear him.
Yeah, I've lost him.
I guess somebody has to run to his office and tell him that we lost him.
I'll run down there.
I think Ishwar might be right there. I don't know whether it's there. But... Oh, bumped out. I think it's coming back in. He'll come back in. All right.
sorry. Okay, so I'm sorry, guys. Where did you guys lose me?
Right at the slide, you started the slide, the last slide. So just go back to the same slide.
This one here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually, could it go one slide back, Dr. O'Connor? One more.
I think you're right here. He was talking about.
Yeah, I think you're fine. Yes. Okay. I think 19, 20. Yeah. One of those slides are fine. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. Right, so we're trying to get hyperspectral imaging and polarization imaging. And let me see if I can get my pointer here. And so, right, so I don't know where you guys lost me, but I'll just start with the polarization discussion again. That light is an electromagnetic field with a transverse electric field. And so we want to understand, and that's sort of characterized by its polarization state. And we want to characterize that polarization state as well as the color and the intensity. And that's sort of the classic example of a polarized light is sort of polarized sunglasses, where if you have sunlight coming down, it's unpolarized light, it would hit a surface like a windshield, and the reflected light then becomes preferentially polarized in one orientation. And so if you have sunglasses, you would that cancel out that polarization state, and you would reduce that glare, and that's sort of the advantage of having polarized sunglasses over just sort of unpolarized glasses. You have an opportunity to reduce glare that has a preferential polarization state. All right, so if you think about polarization imaging, it's similar applications to the hyperspectral imaging, where you have applications in biomedical imaging, in mechanics, and astronomy. And so, for example, in biomedical imaging, here's a tumor where you have this imaging technique where if it's polarization sensitive, it better defines the tumor. And in particular, the advantage here, it defines the edge of the tumor really well. So if you went in to have surgery, you could have a very precise location to extract the tumor. And so, you know, there's advantages, and this is sort of just one application where you could see the advantages of having, being able to detect the polarization state of light. And if you want to, and so I won't go into too much details about how to characterize it, but it's defined by what's called Stokes parameters usually, where you're just looking at the linear polarization state orientation as well as the circular polarization state, and you characterize it by these Stokes parameters here. Ultimately, to get the Stokes parameters, and if you were to do this like imaging, you would do it similarly to the RGB imaging system, where you would have, instead of color filters, you'd have polarization filters. So you have polarizers oriented in different directions. Okay, so light comes in, and if it had different polarizations, it would transmit through to a different extent depending on this polarization orientation to the detector. And then from that, you could reconstruct and get an idea of what is that polarization state of that incoming light. Okay. And this is similar to the RGB with the filters. And so you're spatially separating out different detectors, which then ultimately is going to reduce your spatial resolution of your image. And if you combine now trying to get lots of colors with polarization, and you were trying to do this with imaging, so with a sort of just a snapshot picture, you would end up having a lot of lateral detector elements to collect all that information. And so for one location of the picture, you would actually have to have this fairly large superpixel collecting all that information. And this would be for, let's say, 5 colors, and then the color filters are now going to be separated by a fairly large distance. And so the idea here that we want to look at is, can we take all this lateral information and place it vertically and not have the spatial spreading out of that information, but I'll get all that information in one location. And that's sort of where we get this inspiration from the mantis shrimp. And we want to do this multispectral, hyperspectral, and polarization sensitive along a single optical axis. And so if we look at the mantis shrimp's eye, it can detect, so here's the mantis shrimp eye, here's a close-up of the eye. It consists of a range of pixels along the surface, effectively, that are called ommatidia. And here's a sort of side view of those. They're these long tubes. And as light comes in, they get focused into these, what's called rhabdom, and then there's these photoreceptors along the length of the tubes. And between the photoreceptors, there's some color filters. And so they can detect a color and then let some other light transmit through, detect another color, let other light transmit through. And for this, what's called the midband, this middle part, they can detect 12 colors. So here's the 12 photoreceptors, or the 12 colors it senses, whereas our eyes only sense 3. And they can detect polarization. And so that's primarily done in what's called the dorsal hemisphere and the ventral hemisphere, these regions, where they do a similar thing where they have this rhabdom, this vertical tube, where within that they have what's called microvilla that essentially rotate the polarization state of the light. And then they detect that rotated polarization state of light. And they have these different ommatidia, or different pixels, with different orientations of what is essentially an optical retarder rotating the polarization state of light. And from that, they get the polarization information. So I know that's sort of, I don't know if we can follow all of that, but this is sort of just motivation, and it's just sort of interesting, but I don't expect you to kind of follow every detail here. But we take inspiration from that and we try to create a photodetector that we call stomatopod-inspired multispectral and polarization sensitive sensor. Simple, although it's not that simple, but call it a simple sensor, where we, this mantis shrimp is a type of stomatopod, so that's where we get that from, where we take sort of various inspirations from the shrimp, mantis shrimp. So for one, here's our design, effectively. My computer's freezing again. I hope I don't lose you guys. Where we have this vertical stacked optical sensor that's like one of these rhabdom here. And then on top of that, we have these semi-transparent photovoltaic cells that collect some of the light and then let other light through to be transmitted further down the stack. We orient the polymer semiconductor within this organic photovoltaic cell, and that results in polarization sensitivity, which I'll get to in a second. And that's sort of like the microvilla, these oriented anisotropic materials within the eye of the shrimp. And then lastly, the color filter is done with something called a folded retarder. These these elements here called FR, and I'll really the enabling features here for this design are the polarization sensitive photodetectors and the folded retarders that do the color filtering. So I just want to kind of talk about those briefly if I can. So the idea here is that we have light come in, we have effectively polarizers, but instead of just polarizers that just only let one polarization through, the polarizers are the photovoltaic cells. So whatever light isn't transmitted is collected, and we can measure that amount of light that's being collected. So it's almost like a polarizer that's all simultaneously a photodetector. And so if we have some light come through and we have some white light represented by these different colored arrows and it has some polarization state, that would be detected by the first two polarized photodetectors. And those polarizers are in different orientations to figure out what is that polarization state. And then this latter stack also measures polarization and color. And the way it measures color is through taking advantage of these birefringent elements. And so what that means is if we have light come in and it has a certain polarization, then, or let's say it's unpolarized light and it's white light. So we have purple, blue, green, yellow, red. If it goes through a polarizer, now it becomes polarized and all the light has a single orientation, polarization orientation. And if we have a optical anisotropic refractive index material, the polarization state will rotate. And it'll rotate, the amount of rotation will depend on the wavelength. And so if we rotate it for each of these colors, and then we put a polarizer at 90 degrees at the bottom, the light that was rotated 90 degrees will transmit. This green light will transmit, and the sort of the component of the blue and yellow that can be horizontal or parallel to this bottom polarization will also transmit. And then we can use this as a color filter. And it turns out, and this is sort of more complicated, so I'll likely just sort of skip over this detail for the most part, if my slide will agree with me, is that you can stack these birefringent elements to create a really narrow band of light that's being rotated 90 degrees. So if we have this folded retarder, we can now take this light with, let's say it's polarized light, white light. We can use this folded retarder design just to rotate one polarization state or one color. And then we can use the polarized detector to detect that color and let everything else that has the other polarization transmit through. So then we can detect blue, green, yellow, red. And sort of here's the folded retarder design we made. This is with Ali Altaquai and electrical engineering with Mike Kudinov, who fabricated these folded retarders to make these really distinct color filters. And then the other part of this is having this polarized photovoltaic cell. And so here's an example of a polarized cell we make in our lab. This is Omar Awartani, who was my first graduate student, actually. You can see the semi-transparent solar cell. And depending on the polarization state of the light, the incoming light, you see that here's the IV curves. The one polarization state has a much stronger response than the other one. So now we know what the polarized state is as it's being collected and transmitted through the cell. And the way we achieve this is, I think the Zoom plus my PowerPoint is too much for my computer. It turns out that in these conjugated polymers, the optical dipole transition moment is along the backbone. So when the electric field is parallel to the polymer backbone is when you excite the electron. And so typically when you cast these films, you spin cast the film, the polymer, if we take a vertical view of this, it's sort of oriented in all directions. But if we were able to align the polymers in the plane of the film, we could make it sort of intrinsically polarization sensitive, and that's what we do. And so we take this, spin cast this film, that's now isotropic. We pick it up on an elastomer, shown in the top here. We stretch it to orient all the polymers, and then we print it. And you can see here in this picture, we have the isotropic absorption Then if we stretch it, we have parallel absorption increasing, and in the other direction, the absorption decreases, and now it's polarization sensitive. We can, if we look at this P3HT PCBM, the PCBM doesn't, it's a small molecule, it doesn't align, it's not polarization sensitive. So we took this sort of one step further, and we decided to use two polymers, and this is work by Pratik shown here, that have complementary absorption characteristics that now we absorb across the entire visible spectrum. When we stretch this film, both polymers align, and now we have a polarization sensitive detector across the entire visible spectrum. And here's the responsivity for the different polarization states. So for a photodetector, we're usually interested in responsivity. How much amps do we get of current out do we get for watts of light in? And then even more recently, Harry, who's a graduate student in the lab now, used this rubbing method to even push this responsivity difference even more. And so by doing that, we become more polarization sensitive, and the polarized light that's perpendicular to the alignment direction is highly transparent. And so we took this stack and we tried to image something. And so this is just a single pixel here. We don't have an array yet. It's sort of a work in progress. But we stacked these up vertically. We took a transparency that's a bunch of colored pencils, and we put polarized plastic on top that spells NCSU in different polarization directions. So if we just took this with a regular camera, you wouldn't know what those orientations would be. And so we then scan this transparency around and then focus the light into this single pixel, and then to image the scene, if you will. And so these are the results. This is the image of the pencil being sort of imaged by this simple sensor concept. And you can see all the colors accurately reproduced. And more than that, we can simultaneously get the polarization state. So again, that's represented by the arrows here. And you can see the NCSU now, which are polarized films with different polarized orientations, can be defined, as well as the colors simultaneously. So that's sort of this idea of this polarized imaging concept. And now we just have to work on improving it by going to an array to get the snapshot imaging, which will be a challenge. And we can also redesign these things to actually do more colors. So that example was just 4 colors. We have modeling that suggests we should be able to get up to 15 colors filtered out, and that would bring us closer to what we consider hyperspectral. And so that's sort of where we're going with this concept. So pretty excited about that. All right, that takes us to the last topic here, and that is looking at device stability of these organic photovoltaic cells. So hopefully, you know, in the first couple topics, you saw the applications of where there's opportunities to use these detectors and solar cells. And now we have to make sure that they're stable, which is a challenge. So these organic photovoltaics aren't always stable. And so one of the advantages people always point to is, you know, that they can be coated, solution coated on plastic, room temperature, and be flexible. And so people often want to just make flexible solar cells. And it turns out, as shown and these are flexible solar cells here, if you can't sort of make it out. They're all bent and stacked. And in this paper, that sort of was one of the early ones mass producing these flexible solar cells. They noticed that mechanical failure was a really common failure mechanism. And so we wanted to look at what is the reason for that? What's the origin of that mechanical failure? And beyond that, even if you just had some of these solar cells sitting on a shelf in the dark, not flexing, they can still degrade. And so here's an example of organic solar cells fabricated on glass, put in a dark room in inert atmosphere, and you'll still see performance degradation for some of them. Some of them are quite stable, but some degrade. And so we're trying, and we argue that this degradation is sort of a morphological change. So the morphology is not stable. And the question is, you know, is the morphological stability connected to the mechanical stability, and can we improve both simultaneously? And so to understand that, we have to look at the active layer morphology in a little bit more detail and more accurately. So I drew this picture in the beginning of P3HT and PCBM and just these sort of pure domains, but that's not exactly what it looks like. More realistically, that small molecule mixes with the polymer and you get this sort of mixture of the two. And it forms sort of 2 or 3 phases. One is a miscible polymer small molecule phase where they are kind of mixed together. Then you have depending on the amount of small molecules, a small molecule rich phase. And then you could potentially have a pure polymer phase if it's semicrystalline, which most of these aren't semicrystalline. So you generally have these 2 phases. And if you look at a phase diagram of what this looks like to understand how miscible these components are. Oh, sorry. Let me just, yeah, well, let me skip over this for the sake of time, actually. So we can look at this, how miscible they are by measuring a phase diagram. So what is the miscibility as a function of temperature? And so this binodal line here would be how miscible, how much small molecules would be in the polymer matrix in thermodynamic equilibrium. And so if you look at this case example here of P3HT and this other small molecule, EHIDTBr, at equilibrium, at room temperature, the amount of small molecule in that polymer phase would only be about 7%. And that would be too small. If it's not miscible enough, you get large segregation between the polymer and the small molecule. And it goes back to that initial picture I talked about where the exciton now that's formed can't reach an interface and you can't dissociate it to get the charge out. And if it does, you might just see an island of the small molecule and you still can't get the charge out. And so that's really, that's not good for performance. But you can cast the solution and crash it out of solution to be in this non-equilibrium state where they are mixed. And if they're too mixed, that's also not good. You want some sort of mixture that's close to this percolation threshold where you get the exciton dissociation and you can get charge collection out of this solar cell. And so if we cast the solution in this example here, we could cast it and it would be in this state at room temperature or this sort of level of miscibility. And over time, it's not in equilibrium. So the small molecules will want to diffuse out. And so they diffuse out and trying to approach this binodal. And the performance actually goes up as it passes this percolation threshold, which would be sort of the ideal morphology. But then it keeps on going and it degrades. And that's not good. And that ends up, you know, that's this sort of failure of your device, even in the dark. And so Masoud here, Masoud Ghassemi and Harold Ade's group in physics measured the diffusion behavior of a huge number of these combination of materials. And he did this with time of flight sims, where he measures, so he takes a bilayer, so he takes the polymer small molecule and doesn't blend them, but just makes a sandwich structure, heats it up and watches the small molecules diffuse into the polymer, gets the concentration profile of that small molecule, fits it to 1D solution to fix second law of diffusion, and gets the diffusion coefficient. And so from that, you can get sort of the expected rate of the diffusion of the small molecule in that blend. And so he did this again for a range of polymers and small molecule systems. And what you want is you want really low diffusion. You want to cast this thing and you don't want the morphology to change. And so this graph here shows the diffusion coefficient versus temperature. And there's an ASTME standard for solar cells that says that they should be stable at 80 degrees Celsius. So if we have 80 degrees Celsius here, and then these hatched lines represent the diffusion coefficient that would correspond to a small molecule diffusing 20 nanometers over 1 year and 10 years. And so this is sort of the threshold for stability. If they diffuse more than 20 nanometers in a 100 nanometer thick film, you're very likely going to have some significant degradation. And so, like I said, he did this for a range of molecules, and you can see we want to be down here in this space. And you see most of these don't meet that criteria. Most of these combinations don't meet that criteria. Some do, and many don't. And so what is the fundamental driver for this behavior? And so this is where we turn to thermomechanical behavior. So if you think about it, you know, if these things are viscoelastic materials and there's some movement in there, then that may enable some of that diffusion to happen. And so we looked at dynamic mechanical analysis, which the department was kind enough to purchase a DMA a few years ago. That has been quite useful for our lab to look at the thermomechanics of the polymers and the small molecules to some degree. And so when we look at these graphs, what we're looking at is the storage modulus, so the elastic response of the material, the loss modulus, or the viscous response, and then the ratio of the two, which is the tan delta. And as you heat up the material, there's oftentimes some relaxation that occurs. Here's one at -21 degrees Celsius, and here's a large one at 150, which would be considered a glass transition. And so we're interested in this behavior, and we look at this for some of the polymer semiconductors that we're looking at. And what you can see is there's this relaxation at around -20 degrees Celsius, but they're not too different. So this glass, we don't actually think this is a glass transition. It's more like a sub transition, but they're quite similar. So there's not too different. They're not differentiating too much there. Where they are differentiating is in the stiffness of the materials. The polymers have a different stiffnesses. And so does that relate to diffusion, I guess, is the question. And we found that it does. And so for the different polymers, as you make them stiffer, you reduce the diffusion coefficient of a given small molecule. And that sort of tracks, which sort of makes intuitive sense. And the other part of this is, what about the small molecule? Well, it turns out if you make the small molecule, give it a higher glass transition temperature, so this would be the glass transition temperature of the small molecule. So at what point does it go from sort of a glassy to a sort of viscous state, a viscous fluid state? For a given polymer, you increase the TG and you also drop the diffusion. So now we can really start to define thermomechanical properties. You want high stiffness, high glass transition temperature materials to really reduce this diffusion coefficient to have really stable, morphologically stable devices, to really make them last for an extended period of time. And so that's sort of one aspect of this. And then it's also, you know, coupled to just more generally the mechanical characteristics. So I guess in the last 5 minutes, I'll try to cover this quickly. And so, you know, we have stiffness in the glass transition temperature, but we want to make sure that these are mechanically stable devices, right? And one way we can characterize this is just by looking at how ductile the materials are. If they're relatively brittle, that's not a good sign. And so we take these three polymers and we measured their crack onset strain. So again, they're thin films, 100 nanometers thick, so it's hard to just put them on a tensile tester. So we put them on an elastomer and stretch the elastomer and then look at the mechanical, or when the films crack, at what strain the films crack. And we see, generally speaking, FTAs, which are kind of here, this polymer, have the higher diffusion coefficient than, let's say, the PBDBT polymers that are down here. And that tracks with the crack onset strain. So the stiffer film has a lower crack onset strain, which is sort of a common correlation. And as we add in the small molecules into this film, the small molecules that have lower diffusion coefficient also end up lowering this crack onset strain. So lower diffusion coefficient, stiffer materials, lower or less ductile. And so there's sort of this trade-off here between morphological stability and mechanical stability that we need to really understand and develop strategies to overcome if we want these to be flexible and stable solar cells for multiple years. And that's sort of where this research is ongoing. Just real quick, lastly, so that's crack onset strain, and that's one measurement, and that's sort of informative about how ductile the material is. But if we show this picture of, you know, failure mechanisms, what we're really interested in is the cohesive fracture, the fracture energy when these things start to break apart. That would ultimately lead to failure for a flexible device. And we can characterize this fracture energy, and we get a certain value. We do this 4-point bending measurement where we look at the crack propagating along the film of the solar cell. And if you just look at values we want to see, if you think about this graph here, or look at this graph here, we have nanoporous glass films that are around 50% porous, so you would expect those to be relatively weak, have a few joules per meter squared in terms of their fracture energy. But we want to be in this cross-linked polymer film, like a really tough polyester coating, for them to be kind of mechanically robust. And it turns out a lot of these polymer small molecule systems are down here. This is the P3HT PCBM that I've talked about several times now. Really low fracture energies, so that's why they're so prone to failure. And so how do we overcome that? And one way to overcome that is to actually look at, instead of going to this polymer small molecule, where the small molecule acts as an anti-plasticizer, makes the film brittle, weakens it. What if we just have two polymers, right? Get rid of this small molecule, blend two polymers together. Polymer small molecules get all the attention because they're higher efficiency. All polymer systems, they're good. They're over 12% now, but they're lower. But if they're more mechanically stable, maybe they're the better option. And they should be more morphologically stable because it's harder for a long chain polymer to diffuse over large distances. So we're interested in looking at the mechanics of all polymer solar cells. And we started off a few years ago, Narup in the lab looked at these two polymers and looked at the fracture energy of the blend. And you can see here, it's 1.8 joules per meter squared. Not that different than the polymer small molecule, not good, not where we want to be. And so we kind of went back to the drawing board here and looked at what do we want for an all polymer solar cell. So Narup had also done some work correlating ductility to the fracture energy and show that there's generally a pretty good correlation for these different polymers. And so we want a polymer that's fairly ductile. It's an easier measurement, so that can be a good screening tool. And that should tell us that we should have high fracture energy. We also want polymers that have a low ductile to brittle transition temperature. And so we also characterize that, and I won't go into those details because I'm running out of time here. But Narup did a nice job, again, going back to the DMA to figure out where do we see a ductile to brittle transition temperature for these polymers. And he characterized the range of polymers and found that a lot of them here, the ductile to brittle transition temperature is around -20°C, which is a good sign. You wouldn't expect to hit that temperature for a lot of operating conditions. And so what we looked at for candidate polymers is this FTAS polymer and this PNDI 2ODT2 polymer that have, which was similar for the polarimeter. They have that complementary absorption. They have this ductile to brittle transition that's below 0°C. And lastly, we looked at the molecular weight dependence on this fracture energy. And so we took these two polymers, we varied the molecular weight we got them from a chemistry collaborator. And we see that once we're above a certain molecular weight shown here, the fracture energy of this blend, which is the blue line, jumps up to that 8 or 9, which is getting closer to what we want for mechanically stable devices. So this is, and beyond that, if we increase molecular weight, we'll also get a bump in the solar cell efficiency, which is another sort of benefit. So we want high molecular weight polymers. We want sort of complementary absorption. We want low sub-TG transitions, so we avoid that ductile to brittle transition. And we can start to design at least mechanically and morphologically stable solar cells. Now it's just sort of getting the efficiency up of these systems. So that is sort of the mechanics side and what we're doing on the mechanics side. And that's pretty much sums up the topics I wanted to talk about today. And if I'd just like to quickly acknowledge folks and collaborators who made this work possible. So this is the lab group here. A lot of the diffusion stuff I mentioned for the solar cell stability was with Harold Ade in the physics department and his student who's now a postdoc, Masoud Gassimi. A lot of the mantis shrimp work was done with Mike Kudanov in the electrical engineering department and his students Ali and Ronanen. And the plant growth work was done with Heike Sederoff, who's in the plant microbial biology department, and her student Melody Charles. And then UNC, Wei Yu is a chemist, and that case Bum Jum Kim, which is the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. They're both chemists who supplied a lot of the materials to make these studies possible. So that's all I got. I thank everyone and for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
All right, we have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. So if you want, you can type it on this group chat and I can read it out, or you can just chime in and start talking and I'll call your name. Anybody? So I'll kick it off, Brendan. Whenever we talk about things like that, one is of course the reliability is a big issue. Second thing is they always talk about, when you talk about solar, the LCOE, the cost of electricity.
Yeah.
Two things that they always talk about, and they have to bring that down to what conventional electricity is. So reliability becomes a big issue because, of course, when the surfaces get exposed to nature, the potential degradation, right? That you talked about a little bit about it, but that becomes a big challenge, and especially when you're looking at something which is profitable. You're making something like farms or something like that.
Yeah. So the question is.
The question is what I mean, you're looking at all the aspects of it, but what do you think it is in terms of long-term application and in terms of getting it into?
Yeah. So right. So these organic solar cells, I think, if you ask someone, I think 8 years ago, if 18% efficiency would be possible, they'd probably say no way. People were aiming for 12%, and so that's been a really would reduce this levelized cost of energy, right? Because you can produce more power now. But even then, I think generally folks want to use organic solar cells not as a competition for silicon. The silicon's getting cheaper, the levelized cost of energy is getting lower, and it's hard to have any solar cell technology compete with it on a head-to-head basis. And so that's where, I guess, in the organic solar cells, people are looking at sort of niche applications that could fit a role that silicon can't do well. And one of those is semi-transparent solar cells, so building integration. So if we can attach these to windows, and for the example of the greenhouse, to a greenhouse, then there may be opportunities to make it a viable technology. And if it is on the glass of a greenhouse, for example, then it's potentially sandwiched between two glass layers, which would be relatively robust in terms of encapsulation and stability. And so, yeah, I think it's an open question about the ultimate price, the dollars per watt or kilowatt hour that you can make these for. There's not really a large enough industry to understand that yet, but there are, I think, opportunities for niche applications. The selling point is always that these materials are cheap and abundant, but no one has yet shown that they are economically viable. So it's sort of an open question. Yeah.
So I have a question from Shawning here. For the organic solar cell, is there a need for non-destructive evaluation? You're looking at a potential.
Sorry, yeah, that's a good question. If I can sort of get out of my presenter mode, we saw there was a slide here with solar cell degradation being in the dark. I mentioned that we have solar cell efficiencies measured over time, and they degrade. And it was only loosely connected to the morphology change. We don't know specifically what is all the mechanisms causing that degradation. And so if there was sort of a way to probe that non-destructively and figure out, are we talking about a chemical degradation? Is it a morphological degradation? And at what point maybe those processes change during the operation, that would require non-destructive testing. And so I could see definitely an opportunity there. And if these ultimately go out to the field, to the same thing, you'd want to test their operation capabilities in the field without having to, take them offline, pull them apart, and see what's going on. So, sure, yes, absolutely, there'd be applications. So
what about stacking up? You can stack them. If you would it reduce the transparency if you go stack them?
Yeah, it would. And so if you were trying to make tandem solar cells, yeah, so where you'd have the stacked active layers, and that's also an active area of research. There's an opportunity to increase the efficiency. So tandem solar cells commercially are typically these really high, expensive gallium arsenide solar cells that are used for space applications, and they have like 40% efficiency. And you could apply similar concepts here, stack them to try to improve efficiency, try to improve the spectral absorption range. But when you do that, you usually have a loss in voltage. But if you make tandems, you can improve the spectral range without the loss in voltage. And so people are actively looking at that, including Frankie So in the Material Science Department here. But yeah, it would probably reduce the transparency for sure. Yeah.
Another last question from Shadow. For the determination of diffusivity from TOF SIMs, could you elaborate more on your assumption there to use that equation to determine the diffusivity? So, I mean, you can see it all yourself if you want on the chat.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have to default to my student Harold. So there's the paper we're working on that has been under review for over a year, actually, well over a year, probably a year and a half now. And we just responded, or we're just responding now to the latest revisions. And the comment was, yeah, this similar to this one. How do you know the diffusion is accurate, or what are the assumptions and simplifications? So it's interesting because our lab didn't do the diffusion measurements, but I can talk about it a little bit. Where let me go to the slide real quick. The small molecules diffusing into the polymer, but for the degradation mechanism, usually it's diffusion out. And so there is a little bit of a difference there in terms of how you would measure that and what that would mean. But generally speaking, they are not that different without going into too much detail. They're similar enough where I think this assumption that we're going in versus out is okay. And then we can sort of get a rough estimate, at least good enough to understand the diffusion behavior. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's sort of one of the assumptions.
We can have a discussion offline too. But thank you, Brian. And I think it was a pretty good informative seminar, and appreciate your taking time. And also actually a lot of faculty and students who showed up for the talk, and appreciate everybody being here, even via Zoom. And thank you again, and have a good weekend, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.